hali ya maisha. Nataka kuambia kwamba
Nyakoro mkajongo doka kachiel kama bende twak nentiere mano mar riwruok mar FKE kod jofwambo mondo winjo ni to en ang'o ma dhi nyime kanyo.
The Act and KMTC Act. The Federation has always advocated investments in measures that create more job opportunities and improve productivity, such as skill development through strengthening organizations such as NITA to execute their mandate fully to deliver on skill development and the employment agenda. These recommendations will put employers at a disadvantage because, first, NITA has a mandate of undertaking occupational training, which is aligned to the government's bottom-up economic transformation agenda, as it focuses on enhanced productivity at the workplace through sustained partnership with employers. Secondly, the role played by NITA to facilitate apprenticeship and indentured learning will be lost if the Industrial Training Act is repealed. And lastly, the Training Levy Fund is dependent on contributions by employers. It's not a government fund like others. Thus, the proposed merger will not serve the intended purpose of the Training Levy Fund and will hamper industrial training at a time when relevant skills are needed in the labor market. With those remarks, we thank you for your attention, and we are now ready for any questions that you may have. Asanteni sana, and thank you.
Thank you. We'll take some questions. We'll just say your name, your question, and then we'll
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Maybe I can address, thank you for those questions actually, but I can address the first question, which was really an overall question on the monetary policy conduct, essentially. And I think it's a global phenomenon. You see, when inflation is a threat, most policy management people, what they will do is that they will try to ensure that they create a base where the prices are down so that you can have more effective economic growth. So globally, when inflation is a threat, the monetary policy conduct responds by raising the interest rate in order to sort of like mitigate the inflation threat. Now, what is happening in the developed world is that they are also facing the same inflationary pressure, and so they are increasing their interest rates. So if you look at the Fed, they are increasing their interest rates. If you look at the EU, they're increasing their interest rates. Now, on the domestic front as well, we also had our own inflationary pressures. And so in response to that, most of the monetary policy intervention would normally be to raise your interest rates until inflation is under control, to tame it. So, and your question is the fact that is it effective in the domestic environment? Because we saw central bank aggressively increase the central bank rate, by a whole 100 basis points. And that was thought to be quite aggressive, but I think it was a necessary measure at that point in time because we saw the effect. Immediately, the CBR went up. We saw inflation beginning to come down. And the last reported inflation numbers by the central bank team when they were reviewing their monetary policy committee meeting, actual inflation is coming down and it's continuing to come down. Now, what will happen is that once inflation has been tamed, then you will see the monetary policy committee take a more softer stance. In other words, you'll see the CBR beginning to come down. And of course, when the CBR is high, there is the challenge you posed of the fact that, then we start seeing the impact it has on the non-performing portfolio, which starts going up. So it's a concern, but it's a necessary pill to have in order to bring inflation down. So I think now that we are seeing the inflation coming down and the CBR starts coming down, then you'll also start seeing the NPL from the banking sector begin to come down. I hope that addresses the... Yes, it's an issue. I think it's a necessary pain to go through in order to address the long-term benefit that we desire, which is really bringing down the prices and therefore support economic growth. Yeah. Then you asked some question about, there was the issue of presumptive tax, the issue of the national tax policy, and the issue of tax relief. And I think all of them are pointing to one thing, and which is a concern really for us, because we are seeing more tax measures being proposed in order to raise the necessary revenue for the government to be able to meet its development agenda. Now, I think there is a need for that to be balanced with the fact that the disposable income and even the cost of doing business for the organizations and the disposable income for the common man and anybody, what is happening is that is then having that negative effect. And there is therefore need to balance the need for the government to raise the resources to be able to finance the development agenda and the cost of doing business and generally just the good, the comfort of its citizens, so to speak, and the comfort of the organizations that are creating employment and therefore providing the goods that are there for consumption. And so I think on your three questions about the presumptive tax, the national tax policy, and the tax reliefs is an issue of trying to balance the measures of the government raising resources and then, two, giving an economic base for growth.
So the first question is on the impact of taxes on jobs. What are we seeing? And then the other one is on the what employers are trying to cope with all these taxes and profit, what measures are they putting in place to be able to survive?
Thank you for those questions. So to answer the question about job creation and the prospects of that in light of all the changes that we've seen in the last few months, it requires us really to look at the structure of the Kenyan labor market, which we've talked about for quite some time. If you look at our labor market today as a developing economy, which is the same in most of Africa and other developing economies, really we are largely informal. And even the jobs that have been created over the last few years, if you look at any surveys and the outcomes, those jobs are coming from the informal sector, which is 3/4 of the employment sector for those in wage employment. So we have been seeing a reduction in the number of formal sector jobs even before the current regime came into office. The more you tax the formal sector, the more you make it difficult for those enterprises to create jobs. And we are seeing that. We've just been looking at what's happening in Nairobi and in other regions because the Federation of Kenya Employers has offices across this country. We are seeing a reduction in jobs. Enterprises having to really review their business models to be able to support the wage bill. And the taxes that we're talking about are being levied on the formal sector, which is just 15% of the total wage employment in this country. So that is the reality. And when you are under the pressure of tax, which increasingly we are, then you have to look at that. And you cannot take in more people because you can barely afford to pay those that you already have in employment. And that leads to a response to the second question about the changes employers are putting in place to contain the wage bill. We have been talking about flexibility for a very long time as FKE. We need to have flexible laws that allows enterprises to be able to manage the wage bill and to be able to keep people in jobs at the same time. So flexibility is increasingly happening. The changes that we've seen in the world of work have made it very difficult for us to have permanent and pensionable jobs or people in long-term contract types of employment. So increasingly we are looking at short-term, flexible terms of engagement that perhaps either outsources that service or takes on people on contracts for short-term or contracts for a specific task to be done. And once the task is done, then you release that person. Because if you have full-time employees, then there are so many other costs that go with that. The indirect costs, you can add 30% to your wage bill. And all this raft of changes that we're seeing in the laws that we're talking about today, whether it's looking at health, whether it's looking at training, whether it is looking at pay as you earn, and housing levy, just means that there's more burden on employers and they have to come up with innovative ways to get the job done without being stuck with a fixed wage bill. So as a country we need to have that conversation of how to support enterprises to be able to keep people in jobs and also to be able to support job creation. To do that we need some stability in the business regulatory environment for employers to be able to plan.
So we have the fiscal framework, which again is in line with constructive revenue. Then we have the common tariff order we had
going for things like SOFR, secured overnight finance, which rates are very high. And the arrangers, for example, for some of them this year are underrated by IMF. So we are seeing all of these things that are coming from but yet Kenyans are still being banked. Actually, we're looking at 1 year of Kenya Kwanza Alliance. We're seeing the golo, just 1 year the golo is more than Kibaki did in 10 years. Where the employers from this taxation, also the corporate
It's one and the same question.
Yeah.
It's the same question.
Yeah, I think on your question about I think the balance between the taxation and debt, you know, the government normally will fund itself, or rather the government will normally have development plans on the basis of which, of course, they are elected into office. And if very promising, that's how you actually win the electorate to vote for you. And therefore, you then have the obligation to deliver on those promises made through your development plans. And I think that's what we are going through in terms of the fact that there were commitments that the government made to deliver, so they have got to deliver. However, to deliver those projects or those development plans, you actually just have two sources. You either tax the citizenry or you borrow. And it's an issue of trying to balance between your commitments. Are you able to cut on your commitments and therefore sort of like break the trust or the promise that you gave for the electorate? Or are you able to then balance in terms of how much you're able to tax and how much you're able to borrow to finance your plans? And I think that's the balancing, the balance that needs to be created here. And I think your question is linked to, are we in the right balance? You see, our view has been that, and I think we have addressed the issue of taxation. We have expressed the views on terms of taxation, that the measures that are coming day in, day out, I think are on the higher side, you see. And it needs to be relooked at in the sense that it needs to be brought down to what is actually what I can say affordable, what can be both by the corporations and by the individual on one. Now when you talk about debt, there's a point at which you have to finance your plan through debt, and debt is not bad, but it has got to be sustainable. You see, and the sustainability of the debt depends on a number of factors. One of them is, are you going to balance between domestic debt and foreign debt? Right now, I think one of the challenges we are having, there is a Eurobond that is maturing in June next year. It's $2 billion. And the question is that, do we have the capacity to be able to repay it? Will you have the resources to repay it? And I think that's one thing that we have got to balance, because defaulting on a debt like that is not thinkable. It's not something that you can fathom. Well, restructuring can be an alternative in terms of refinancing it, but you have got to have the right conditions in the market. Because at the time when you come to restructure and the conditions are not appropriate, you might actually be getting a much more expensive debt to repay the outgoing debt. So it's an issue of balancing. Personally, I'm not particularly very worried, because I think we have got the capacity to repay it. That will not be the problem. I think the issue is just that, are we able to sacrifice the other priorities in order to pay it? And are we willing to? Because that is a political decision to make, you see. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Questions.
Which, how do you know they already taken? He's been taking photos.
Yeah, he's taking so many.
He's been taking very many photos.
Korom gajuang mano na twak motenore kod weche mag nengo maute pachoka winjo ka gilose weche mopogore kod jogo ma gin jogo mondiko ji giwacho kanyo gigo manyalo biro chuno mondo mi weg kembe kata jogo mandiko ji okenge mag biro kao mondo gin bende gibed kod fuongruok e seche ma bende nengo mar ngima idhore ayete weche mag andika